Could we see a significant trade between the Blackhawks and the Maple Leafs involving multiple players going each way? We also have the trade rumor updates on the Vancouver Canucks, Colorado Avalanche, and Minnesota Wild, possibly even the Montreal Canadiens being connected to the Wild as well. Plus, we have news on the NHL waiver wire and a significant update between the NHL and KHL communications. A lot more coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As you can see, I'm not in my normal recording studio. We are officially on the road. I know a few of you might know, but I'm actually going to be in Ottawa for the rest of this week. We'll be going to the Thursday night game between the Sens and the Kraken. So we'll be on the road here, recording likely from the hotel throughout the week. And then I will be in Quebec for a couple days as well before heading back home. So you'll be seeing some different sceneries here throughout the week. So stay tuned for that. We have news from the NHL waiver wire. A few players placed on waivers yesterday. We'll find out later today if they are cleared or if they were claimed, and that's Danny DeKeyser of the Detroit Red Wings, of course, longtime veteran defenseman on the final year of his contract. I'm going to assume he likely clears. Then there's Andre Schuster as well with the Lightning. Has been around the league a long time, an undrafted defenseman. Played for quite a bit in Tampa, ended up away for a few years in Europe, came back, and he's kind of been back and forth a bit this year. So we'll see what happens with either of those guys. Now, as I mentioned, we have a pretty significant update between the KHL and the NHL. Apparently, the NHL, due to the ongoing events and situation between Russia and Ukraine, has suspended what they call their Memorandum of Understanding, which kind of cuts off communication. So it could cause some issues here. Clearly, it could have a big impact on KHL free agents coming over to the NHL. From my understanding from this memorandum of understanding that they have between the two leagues is that they would be able to verify contract status for players and that type of thing. I know in the past they have had some like a series over in Europe of NHL teams playing KHL teams. Obviously, that's not going to be taking place. I know the NHL's already made it known and clear that they won't be planning or hosting any events in Russia anytime soon, which, obviously for no surprising reasons on that front. So this could have an impact. Obviously, the KHL is going to be in, like I mentioned the other day, possibly some financial difficulty and financial trouble. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of sanctions against the country of Russia, and a lot of its top oligarchs or wealthy businessmen, which obviously fund a lot of that. So we'll see where things go. Numerous players have terminated contracts that are, especially non-Russian players that are either from other parts of Europe or North America, that have decided they want to head back. And I also saw that Jake Virtanen's contract was terminated, but I think that might be a case of the team terminated the contract for violating terms of the agreement or something. I didn't get a chance to read through the full details there because I was on the road all day yesterday, but Virtanen seems to be done in the KHL as well. So like I said, that could be some big update. There's also some still discussions and considerations being made for the draft coming up this summer. It is possible that the NHL may either prevent or recommend that teams don't draft Russian players. I don't know if it'll get to that. Well, I guess we have time, I guess. I'm not sure when the NHL will feel the need to make a decision, but the draft obviously is still a few months away. So they could see where things go, but it's not so much that they want to prevent those players from ever coming over or being drafted. It's just that they are concerned about those players getting work visas through U.S. or Canadian governments. And as I mentioned in other videos talking about that situation, it is a real concern because that's obviously something the league can't control what the governments decide to do. And any players that are going to be needing a work visa, especially for the upcoming season next fall, I know there is legit concerns on if there could be prevention made from them getting one. So we'll have to see where things sit on that front. But certainly another developing situation to keep monitoring here. Now on to the trade talk of the day. A lot of this comes from the latest 32 Thoughts podcast. And of course, there was also a Sportsnet or interview, should say, with Frank Saravalli talking about a big Chicago-Toronto trade. We'll get to that in just a minute. But from 32 Thoughts, they talked a lot about Minnesota, Montreal, Vancouver, Colorado, which we'll all get into here momentarily. I want to start with Minnesota. Of course, they have a highly rated college prospect in Jack McBain. Of course, his father's a former NHL player as well. Boston College, doing extremely well, played for the Olympic team in Canada. It looks like he's going to probably not sign with Minnesota and become a highly sought-after college free agent. Now, we've seen how this has gone in the past. Doesn't mean he's going to turn into an NHL star. Like, there is some possibilities for sure. He looks like he has a lot of talent, but we've seen some other highly touted guys come into the NHL and not really have a lot of long-term sustained success. Like Jimmy Vesey's a prime example of that. But if Minnesota has his rights, it is quite possible that he could be involved in a trade to help them add at the deadline. If they're not going to sign him anyways, then it certainly makes a lot of sense that they would move along his rights. But of course, they're not going to have any interested parties in that regard unless the other team knows they can sign him, because he would become a free agent in August if they don't get the job done on a contract. Now, the other day we talked about the possibility of the Habs moving Shea Weber's contract because he's not expected to play again, still has a few years left on the term. And according to 32 Thoughts and Elliot Friedman, getting information and some discussion with Michael Russo, who's the athletic writer for the Wild, it sounds like, really it makes a lot of sense, as I mentioned, that the Wild are a prime team that would make a lot of sense to acquire that contract. Now, as I mentioned when we first talked about it, it would be two reasons really why the team would want that. One, a team like Arizona, if they're that may not need to put it on LTIR, if they need to spend to get to the floor, then clearly that's an option, so that they could, because the real dollars going out is not as much as the cap hit either. So it saves you some money, but it gets your cap hit up, so you kind of hit the NHL requirements. And then there's a team like the Wild, who we know bought out Parise and Suter and have some significant cap recapture, or not recapture, but the cap penalties from the buyouts for the next couple of years. So they're gonna be in a real cap crunch because of those buyouts. So look, this is a pivotal year for them to really try to make some noise in the playoffs, because if they can't figure out a way around it, it's going to be hard for them to kind of move around the roster and navigate through keeping the team together to continue getting better, building towards, hopefully winning a Stanley Cup eventually. So adding the LTIR pool and a Weber contract would make a ton of sense for the Minnesota Wild. So obviously I don't know what they'd have to go to Montreal, but when you have a prospect like Jack McBain, that's very interesting. As Elliot and Marc talked about on the podcast, it makes a lot of sense. Like, doesn't mean it's going to go down that way. And they were kind of joking that, GMs have such a hard time making trades sometimes that they kind of just came up with one there that would make a lot of sense. Montreal's rebuilding. Obviously a player in Boston College, which I'm sure Ken Hughes has probably seen a fair bit as well. Seeing how he has his own son playing at Northeastern. Like, they obviously, between him and Gorton have a lot of ties to the area. I'm sure they've seen those Boston area, college hockey teams play a fair bit. So it could be something that they might jump on, but they're not going to do it unless they can get the player signed. And there could be other pieces involved as well. So look at Minnesota as being a prime contender for that contract, should the Habs pull the trigger on that kind of deal. Now, when it comes to the Avalanche, it looks like they may be pivoting away from a potential Claude Giroux trade. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but it looks like they may be looking in other directions. And to be honest, as much as Giroux made a lot of sense, the other kind of theory on what they might be doing makes a lot of sense as well. And the way we've seen them play lately, you have to wonder, will they go into the postseason with the goaltending they have? It's debatable. I don't think they really want to make a change in goal. I think they have confidence in what they have, but they also have other areas of need that they really want to kind of add on to it here for having a legit shot at a cup. So if you look at that, they have obviously Nathan MacKinnon's contract's not too far from expiring. They have Nazem Kadri having a career year now, who's expiring this year, going to be tough to re-sign. If they made a trade instead for a player like, for example, like a JT Miller in Vancouver or an Andrew Kopp in Winnipeg, who they could get signed, that could give them some Kadri insurance. It gives them some extra depth now to really bolster that middle sixth in the lineup, which really, obviously makes them deeper and stronger for the playoffs and a cup run. And then at the same time, if they can't get Kadri signed, if they got a guy like Miller, for example, he could slide right into that number 2 spot next year because he still has a year left on his contract. He could replace Kadri, give him probably similar production, because it's hard to say if Kadri can keep up what he's doing longer term or not. And then at the same time, he's expiring before Nathan MacKinnon's next contract would kick in, which gives them the flexibility there to be able to move on again. And then obviously with the bump up in MacKinnon's pay, they could, kind of decide what they need to do at that point based on where everything else is at and cap situation, etc. So it would make a ton of sense if they went after a guy like Miller. Doesn't mean that Vancouver's going to move him, of course. It doesn't mean it's going to get done. We know that based on what they were saying here, that the Canucks essentially are extremely interested in whatever they do to get a top young defenseman in return. That seems to be their prime motivation here, is to get some cap flexibility and at the same time get themselves another top young D who they can kind of either pair up or use along with Quinn Hughes to kind of build around on that back end. Because after Hughes, they don't have the depth. I mean, they have some guys there that are veterans on longer term deals, but it's not probably as strong as they want, and they want like another young guy there to build around. They have some top young forwards they can build around. They have Demko in goal. Another solid D would be good. That's why guys like Miller and Besser are getting so much attention, because they're the guys that have enough value that they could possibly get that done. There was some talk about Bowen Byram in Colorado, so if there was a Miller trade, that's probably what the Canucks would want. I'm not sure that they would do that. I know there was some rumblings about Samuel Girard before. Again, I'm not sure they would want to do that, especially before the playoffs. But that's the kind of trade that the Canucks are looking for, which will make things, I guess, challenging in that sense. But I think for the Avs, if they're going to do a deal with Vancouver, they would probably prefer Miller, because everything just lines up just right in that regard. So because of what they both would want, it makes a deal more challenging and less likely to happen. We saw the connection before with Vancouver and Pittsburgh, with Besser's name being brought up. Of course, a name there would, I'm sure Rutherford would be familiar with, would likely be wanting in return would be Marino, another solid young right shot defenseman who's got some term in his deal. So then obviously a lesser amount than what Besser's going to make. So obviously some interest there. And obviously there's lots of other young D around the league that they could be targeting as well. So we'll have to see where that goes. But obviously the Canucks and Avs have a connection there. The Avs, like I said, might pivot away from Giroux. They're looking at Miller. They have other guys like Andrew Kopp and Winnipeg they appear to be interested in as well. And in regards to Giroux, it looks like Florida has kind of jumped ahead as being like the new, I guess you could say, front runner, or team that appears to be the most interested, with all of the Flyers brass watching a game at the AHL level the other day between the Flyers, the AHL affiliate, and the Florida's AHL affiliate, really getting a good look at Owen Tippett, who could be a centerpiece coming back. And of course, the Panthers don't have a first rounder to offer up for the coming draft, so they'd have to either offer a future first rounder or maybe something else to kind of help the Flyers. And it makes a lot of sense that Tippett would be a guy the Flyers would be interested in, because it doesn't sound like they really want to rebuild. They want to flip this around and kind of retool on the fly here with some younger, skilled talent. And he's a guy who's NHL ready, just can't crack into that deep Florida lineup. So it could be a chance for them to grab a player like that in return. So to me, that does make some sense. But at the same time, that Florida team is so stacked already. Can you just imagine with Giroux what kind of team that would be? That would be absolutely insane. Now, on to the significant trade that Sarah Valley was talking about on Sportsnet Radio between the Hawks and the Leafs that he sees could possibly be happening. And of course, this is really just more in a theory than anything. They were talking a lot about the Leafs, of course, and the goaltending situation. We've heard reports on a couple different fronts that Fleury may not want to be dealt and that he may want to finish out with Chicago. So if that's really the case and he does not change his mind, a deal like this likely could not happen, obviously, because he'll have to kind of grant consent here. But essentially, the theory here that Frank Seravalli said is when you talk about the Leafs and the goaltending situation, we've seen Jack Campbell's stats in the last 2 months plummet. Mrazek hasn't really been great either. Like last night, they pulled out a win, but they had a 3-0 lead, which they blew the lead, came back and win, and they've been able to score themselves out of certain situations, which is good. They're still solid winning record, but when you get to the playoffs, the game's going to change a bit, and they're not going to be able to do that. It's going to, well, at least it's going to be a lot harder. That much we can say for sure. So the win those 6-4 games or the 5-3 games, it's not as likely. So you have to be prepared for a different style, and they need to get the saves. And if they're not getting them, then that's certainly an issue. And the other part of this longer term as well is that the Mrazek contract could become a concern. Like they signed him for 3 years thinking that he would be a bigger part of the goaltending tandem going forward, but he hasn't been able to get the job done. So Seravalli's theory is, listen, if you trade Fleury from Chicago to a third party, then onto the Leafs, so if they get a third team involved, whether it be the Coyotes or Sabres or any of those teams with cap space, you get them to eat some cap space, and you have to give up an extra asset to do it. But you throw a pick at them for renting your cap space, you cut the salary in half, then you get it chomped in half again, you get them under $2 million. Well, then you trade Mrazek to Chicago, along with whatever else that you have to give up. Of course, there's going to have to give them a decent pick or prospect or something as well. But then you get Mrazek, like Chicago's made it clear they're going through a full rebuild. So clearly that's, what do they care really who the goalie is? They need a goalie anyway. Mrazek's under contract for a couple of years. He's decent cap hit. So really, that would probably work for them. You give them Mrazek and something else, of course, whatever that something else needs to be. I'm not sure. You get Fleury's contract down even cheaper. You actually save cap space by getting Fleury cheaper than you get Mrazek, but you're giving up more assets. But then at the same time, with that cap space savings, you could add something else. It gives them an opportunity to continue to add. And if Muzzin is out, which many suspect he won't be back to the playoffs, you have that LTIR pool. You could continue to try to add in other ways as well. There's still a rumor to be looking for a defenseman to add there. A lot of talk about Marc Giordano. I've heard Hampus Lindholm's name. Josh Manson. It's hard to say who ends up being the target. A lot of it's going to depend on asking price, of course, but still, it's a situation where they could add multiple names. And Sarah Valley also mentioned Brandon Hagel, who's been mentioned in trade rumors, which I'm not completely sure Chicago will want to trade because he's pretty young, doesn't have a huge contract, still relatively cost-controlled in RFA status, and he's really improved a lot. Like, he's the last couple of years, like, he's a really solid young player. I can see why the Leafs might want to have him thrown in the deal. But he mentioned him because his name has been in trade rumors about adding a forward depth, getting your goaltender, while at the same time not really eating up any additional cap space because of the third party being involved, and then it still gives you Muzzin's LTIR room to go make another deal to get a defenseman. So they really could load up, and at the same time, the host he was talking to was like, "Well, you're giving up a lot of assets for the future," and his rebuttal was, "Sure, I get that, but at the same time, do you want to go into the playoffs for the 6th year in a row and lose in the first round?" And not to say that they absolutely would, but they'd be up against some pretty darn tough teams, whether it be Tampa or Florida, or if they do make it through round one and you run into Carolina or the Rangers, like they're gonna have themselves a tough time in the playoffs. The teams in the East this year are extremely stacked, and yes, they are really good, but I think a first round loss this year, again, regardless of how good those other teams are, they can't keep kind of passing it off as, "Oh well, we had a really good team, we still believe in the score," like something, it's just, you got to take a chance, right? So yeah, you don't want to mortgage the future too bad, but if you lose and you don't do hardly anything, you're going to get it from the fan base. It's like a lose-lose. So we'll take your pick. What do you want? Do you want them to mortgage the future and go forward, bring in all these guys who they really think can help them win? Or do they do almost close to nothing? And if they do lose, what's next? So let me know what your thoughts on that scenario in the comments, as well as everything else discussed here today. We'll discuss that further. If you're new to this channel, of course, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news, rumors, and analysis on all 32 NHL teams. And if you're going to be at the game on Thursday night in Ottawa, let me know down in the comments. Love to say hello. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.